The water was colder than death itself, and Delilah Jenkins had already made peace with drowning when she saw the horseman on the bank. Her fingers were numb against the waterlogged piece of timber she clutched, her body exhausted from fighting the current of the Arkansas River as it raged through the Kansas plains. The spring rains had swollen it beyond recognition, transforming what was usually a manageable waterway into a churning monster that had swept away everything in its path, including the wagon she had been traveling in with her uncle's freight company. The wagon was gone, her uncle was gone, and Delilah had been clinging to this piece of driftwood for what felt like hours, her arms screaming with the effort of holding on, her legs trailing uselessly behind her in the icy water. She tried to call out, but her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper against the roar of the river. Her vision blurred as water splashed into her face, and she knew with terrible certainty that her strength was failing. The driftwood dipped under the surface and she went with it, the water closing over her head for a moment before she managed to kick back up, gasping and choking. That was when she heard the thunder of hooves. Through the curtain of her wet hair plastered across her face, she saw him. A man on a bay horse, riding parallel to the river, his hat pulled low against the spray. He was shouting something she could not hear over the water, and then he was gone from view as the current swept her around a bend. Delilah's heart sank. He had been her only hope, and now he was behind her, lost to the twisting path of the river. She felt her grip loosening on the driftwood, felt her body going slack with resignation. Maybe it would not be so bad, she thought distantly. Maybe drowning would be quick. Then suddenly, there was a tremendous splash ahead of her, and the bay horse was in the water, the man still mounted, urging the animal forward into the current. Delilah had just enough presence of mind to be amazed at the courage it took, riding a horse into a river like this one, before the man was reaching for her with one long arm extended. "Grab hold," he shouted, his voice cutting through the roar. She let go of the driftwood with one hand, reaching for him, but the current pulled her sideways and she missed. Her fingers closed on empty air, and she cried out in frustration and fear. The horse struggled against the water and the man leaned further out of the saddle, so far she thought he might fall. "Again," he called. "I've got you, just reach." This time when she stretched her arm up, his hand closed around her wrist like an iron shackle. The grip was so strong it almost hurt, but Delilah had never felt anything more wonderful in her life. He pulled, his muscles straining visibly even through his wet shirt, and she felt herself rising out of the water. With his other hand, he grabbed a fistful of her dress at the shoulder and hauled her up with a strength that seemed impossible. For a moment, she was draped across the front of his saddle like a sack of grain, coughing up river water, and then he was shifting her weight, settling her in front of him, one arm locked around her waist. "Hold on to the saddle horn," he said urgently in her ear, and she obeyed, her fingers finding the leather-wrapped horn and gripping it with what little strength she had left. The horse needed no urging. The animal turned and fought its way toward the bank, the man guiding it with his legs and his voice, a steady stream of encouragement that seemed to calm both Delilah and the horse. The current fought them for every inch, but gradually, agonizingly, they drew closer to the shore. Delilah could see the grass now, the solid earth just feet away, and then the horse was scrambling up the muddy bank, water streaming from its sides, and they were out. The man did not stop until they were a good 20 yards from the river, and then he reined in the horse and dismounted in one smooth motion. He reached up for Delilah, and she practically fell into his arms, her legs refusing to hold her weight. He lowered her gently to the ground, kneeling beside her as she coughed and shivered. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "You are safe. Just breathe." Delilah tried to follow his instruction, dragging in great gasps of air between coughs. Her whole body was shaking, whether from cold or shock she could not tell. After a moment, she managed to look up at her rescuer. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair that curled slightly where it was plastered to his forehead, and a face that was all strong lines and angles. His eyes were a striking pale blue, startling against his tanned skin, and they were filled with concern as they studied her. He was soaked through, his clothes clinging to a lean, muscular frame, but he did not seem to care. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. "Delilah," she managed through chattering teeth. "Delilah Jenkins." "I am Carter Lawson," he said. "Can you stand, Miss Jenkins?" "I do not know," she admitted. He nodded as though this was a perfectly reasonable answer. "I am going to get you on my horse. We need to get you dry and warm. There is a ranch not far from here." Before she could respond, he was scooping her up in his arms as though she weighed nothing. Delilah wanted to protest, to say she could manage on her own, but the truth was she could not. She let herself sag against his chest as he carried her to the bay horse, which stood patiently nearby, sides still heaving from the exertion of the rescue. Getting her onto the horse was awkward, but Carter managed it with a combination of strength and determination. He mounted behind her, one arm coming around her waist again to hold her steady, and then they were moving, the horse breaking into a smooth canter across the prairie. Delilah had ridden horses before, but never like this, held secure against a stranger's chest as the world blurred past. She could feel the steady beat of Carter's heart against her back, could feel the warmth beginning to seep from his body into hers despite their wet clothes. She closed her eyes and let herself simply exist, too exhausted to think about what had happened or what would happen next. The ride seemed to last both forever and no time at all. When Carter finally slowed the horse, Delilah opened her eyes to see a ranch house ahead, a sturdy wooden structure with a wide porch and smoke rising from the chimney. There were several outbuildings scattered around it, and a corral with horses that whinnied a greeting to Carter's mount. "This is the Lazy L," Carter said. "My family's ranch. My mother will help you." He dismounted and lifted her down, and this time Delilah found she could stand, though her legs trembled. Carter kept one hand on her elbow, steadying her as he led her toward the house. Before they reached the porch, the door flew open and a woman appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Carter Lawson, what in the name of heaven?" she started, and then she saw Delilah and her eyes widened. "Oh, you poor dear. Get her inside right now." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Carter's mother, whose name was Margaret Lawson, took charge with the kind of calm efficiency that came from years of frontier living. She had Delilah out of her wet clothes and wrapped in a warm quilt before the fire in what seemed like seconds, pressing a cup of hot coffee into her hands and insisting she drink it despite Delilah's protests that she was fine. "You are half frozen and you nearly drowned," Margaret said firmly. "You will drink that coffee and you will not argue with me." Delilah drank the coffee. It was strong and bitter and the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. Carter had disappeared, presumably to change his own wet clothes, but he returned shortly wearing dry denim and a clean shirt, his dark hair still damp but combed back from his face. He looked different somehow, and it took Delilah a moment to realize it was because she could actually see him properly now, not through a haze of river water and exhaustion. He was handsome, devastatingly so. The realization made her feel suddenly self-conscious, aware that she was sitting in his family's parlor wrapped in a quilt with her hair hanging in wet tangles around her shoulders. "How are you feeling?" Carter asked, taking a seat in the chair across from her. Better, Delilah said, and it was true. The warmth of the fire and the coffee were working their way through her body, chasing away the deep cold that had settled into her bones. Thank you. You saved my life. I am just glad I was riding fence line near the river today, Carter said. What happened? How did you end up in the water? Delilah took a shaky breath and told him about the wagon, about the freight run to Wichita that her uncle had been leading, about the rain-swollen river that had looked passable until they were halfway across the ford and the water had surged. The wagon had tilted, then overturned, spilling cargo and people into the current. She had managed to grab onto a piece of broken wagon bed, but her uncle had disappeared under the water. She had not seen him surface. By the time she finished, there were tears running down her face and Margaret had moved to sit beside her, one arm around her shoulders. Carter's expression was grim. How many were in your party? He asked. 4 of us, Delilah said. My uncle, myself, and 2 hired drivers. I will ride back along the river, Carter said, standing. See if I can find anyone else or recover any bodies. The words were blunt but necessary. Delilah nodded, understanding. Margaret squeezed her shoulder. You will stay here, Margaret said. Rest and get warm. When Carter returns, we will figure out what comes next. Carter left, and Delilah was alone with Margaret, who insisted she eat some bread and cheese despite her lack of appetite. The older woman talked as she worked, filling the silence with gentle conversation about the ranch, about the spring weather, about nothing important. Delilah understood she was trying to distract her, to keep her from dwelling on what had happened, and she was grateful for it. She must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing she knew, the light coming through the windows had changed, slanting into late afternoon gold, and Carter was back. She sat up, the quilt falling to her lap, and looked at him with anxious eyes. He shook his head slowly. I found one of the drivers caught on some brush about a mile downstream. He did not make it. No sign of the others yet, but I ran into the sheriff on my way back. He is organizing a search party. Delilah felt her chest constrict. She had known, of course. The chances of anyone else surviving that river had been slim, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way it had not been before. Did you know them well? Carter asked gently. My uncle raised me, Delilah said, her voice barely above a whisper. After my parents died of fever when I was 8, he was all the family I had left. Margaret made a soft sound of sympathy and pulled Delilah into an embrace. The older woman smelled like bread and lavender, and Delilah found herself clinging to her, finally allowing herself to really cry for the first time since the wagon had gone into the water. When the storm of grief had passed, leaving her feeling hollowed out and exhausted, Margaret helped her to a bedroom upstairs. Someone had laid out clothes on the bed, a simple dress that looked like it would fit reasonably well. That was mine when I was younger, Margaret explained. Before I had children and everything shifted around, you are welcome to it. I cannot repay you, Delilah said. Everything I had was in the wagon, my clothes, my money, everything. We are not asking for repayment, Margaret said firmly. Now rest. You have been through an ordeal and you need sleep. We can talk about what comes next tomorrow. Delilah wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. She changed into the borrowed dress, braided her damp hair, and climbed into the bed. The mattress was soft, the quilts warm, and despite everything that had happened, she was asleep within minutes. She woke to full darkness and the sound of voices downstairs. For a disoriented moment, she could not remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back. The river. Carter. The ranch. Her uncle. She lay still, listening to the low rumble of conversation from below. She could pick out Carter's voice and Margaret's and at least one other man. They were talking about the search, she realized, about the river and the bodies and what would happen to the recovered remains. Delilah closed her eyes, but sleep would not return. After a while she got up and moved to the window, looking out over the dark expanse of prairie. There was a half-moon rising, casting everything in silver and shadow. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, this vast wilderness that could kill you as easily as nurture you. A soft knock at the door made her turn. "Come in," she called. Margaret entered, carrying a tray with a bowl of soup and more bread. "I thought you might wake hungry," she said. "It is venison stew. Nothing fancy, but it is hot and filling." Delilah accepted the tray gratefully, suddenly realizing she was indeed hungry. She ate while Margaret sat in the chair by the window and they talked quietly. Margaret told her about the ranch, about how she and her late husband had built it from nothing 30 years ago, about how they had raised 3 children here. Carter was her youngest, she explained. His 2 older brothers had moved on, one to California and one to Texas, but Carter had stayed, taking over the running of the ranch after his father died 5 years past. "He is a good man," Margaret said with obvious pride. "Stubborn as a mule sometimes, but he has a good heart. I am glad he was there today when you needed help." "I will never forget what he did," Delilah said. "Riding into that river, most men would not have risked it." "Most men are not Carter Lawson," Margaret said with a smile. Over the next few days, a routine of sorts developed. The sheriff's search party recovered 2 more bodies from the river, including Delilah's uncle. They found him caught in a tangle of downed trees 3 miles downstream, and the sheriff came to the ranch to tell her in person. Delilah received the news with a numb sort of grief, too exhausted by emotion to feel much of anything anymore. There was a funeral, small and simple, held in the cemetery outside of Wichita. Most of the town turned out for it, not because they had known the deceased, but because that was what people did in this time and place. You showed up for the hard moments. You stood with your neighbors. Carter drove Delilah to the service in his wagon, Margaret beside her, and stood with his hat in his hands while the preacher said words over the graves. Afterward, the question of what Delilah would do now hung in the air, unspoken but present. She had no family, no money, no possessions beyond the borrowed dress she wore. She was 22 years old and suddenly, terrifyingly alone in the world. Margaret solved the problem in her typical decisive fashion. "You will stay with us," she announced over dinner that night. "At least until you figure out what you want to do next. We can always use an extra pair of hands around the ranch, and heaven knows this house is too big for just Carter and me rattling around in it." "I cannot impose," Delilah protested weakly. "It is not an imposition if you are working," Margaret said. "I could use help with the cooking and the garden and the chickens, and Carter could use help with the bookkeeping. His father used to handle that, and since he died, the ledgers have been in shambles." "I do not know anything about running a ranch," Delilah said. "Then you will learn," Margaret said. "We all had to learn once. This is not charity, Delilah. This is an opportunity for all of us. You get a place to stay and some time to heal, and we get help that we genuinely need. It is a fair exchange." Delilah looked at Carter, who had been quiet throughout the exchange. He met her eyes and gave a slight nod. "Mother is right," he said. "We could use the help, and you are welcome here for as long as you need." So it was decided. Delilah Jenkins became, temporarily at least, a member of the household at the Lazy L Ranch. She threw herself into the work with a determination that bordered on desperation, as though if she kept busy enough, she could outrun the grief that nipped at her heels. Margaret taught her how to manage the kitchen garden, how to preserve vegetables for winter, how to render lard and make soap. She learned to gather eggs from the henhouse without getting pecked, to churn butter until her arms ached, to bake bread that rose properly instead of coming out dense and heavy. She learned the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings and long days, the way work ebbed and flowed with the seasons. And in the evenings, after supper was cleared away, she worked on the ranch ledgers. It was clear that Carter was much better with horses and cattle than he was with numbers, and the books were indeed a mess. Delilah had learned basic bookkeeping from her uncle, who had run his freight business with meticulous attention to his accounts, and she set about bringing order to the chaos. She created new ledgers, tracking expenses and income, recording the sale of cattle and horses, noting repairs and purchases. It was satisfying work, seeing the numbers line up properly, seeing the story of the ranch's operation unfold in neat columns. Carter would often sit with her while she worked, ostensibly to answer questions about entries or explain expenses, but mostly just keeping her company. They fell into an easy habit of conversation, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the year they had lost half the herd to a late blizzard. She told him about her childhood, about traveling with her uncle's freight company, about the cities and towns she had seen across Kansas and Missouri. She learned that he was 28, that his favorite horse was the bay gelding that had carried them both from the river, that he had a weakness for his mother's apple pie, and a tendency to downplay his own considerable skills as a horseman. She learned that he was thoughtful and observant, that he noticed when she was having a hard day and would quietly leave wildflowers on the kitchen table, that he had a dry sense of humor that could make her laugh even when she thought she had forgotten how. And slowly, without quite realizing when it happened, she found herself looking forward to those evening hours in the parlor, found herself listening for his footsteps on the porch, watching for him to come in from the day's work, found herself noticing things she had no business noticing, like the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, or the strength in his hands when he handled his horse, or the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention. It was dangerous, these feelings that were developing. Delilah told herself that she was grateful, nothing more, that what she felt was simple appreciation for his kindness. But gratitude did not explain the way her heart beat faster when he entered a room, or the warmth that spread through her chest when he said her name. Summer arrived, hot and dry, and with it came more work. There was hay to cut and stack, cattle to drive to better pasture, constant maintenance on fences and buildings. Carter hired on 2 ranch hands for the season, young men who slept in the bunkhouse and ate their meals at the main house. Delilah found herself cooking for 5 now instead of 3, and the work was endless, but she did not mind. She was too busy to dwell on her loss, too tired at night to lie awake thinking. One evening in late July, Carter asked if she would like to ride out with him the next day to check on the herd in the north pasture. "It is a long ride," he said, "but the country up there is beautiful, and I could use the company." Margaret smiled knowingly from where she sat mending a shirt, but said nothing. Delilah agreed, telling herself it was just a ride, nothing more. They left early, before the heat of the day set in, with a packed lunch in Carter's saddlebag. Delilah rode a gentle mare named Rosie, and Carter was on his bay gelding, Scout. The prairie stretched out around them in every direction, an ocean of grass turned golden by the summer sun, broken here and there by stands of cottonwood trees and the snaking lines of creek beds. Carter was right about the country being beautiful. There was something about the vastness of it, the way the sky seemed to go on forever, that made Delilah feel both small and somehow more alive. They rode in comfortable silence for the most part, speaking only occasionally to point out a hawk circling overhead or a pronghorn bounding away across the grass. The herd was where it was supposed to be, grazing peacefully in a wide valley between low hills. Carter made a slow circuit around them, counting, checking for any sign of injury or illness. Satisfied that all was well, he led Delilah to a spot near a creek where cottonwoods provided shade, and they dismounted to eat their lunch. They sat on the bank of the creek, feet dangling toward the water, and ate cold chicken and biscuits while the horses grazed nearby. It was peaceful, the only sounds the murmur of water over stones and the occasional lowing of a cow in the distance. "I have been meaning to tell you," Carter said after a while, "how much your help has meant, to me and to my mother. I know you came to us under terrible circumstances, but I am glad you stayed." "I am glad too," Delilah said softly. "You and your mother have given me more than just a place to stay. You gave me a reason to keep going when I did not think I had one." Carter turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Delilah," he started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I do not want you to feel obligated. You have been through a lot, and I know you might not be thinking about the future yet. But I need you to know that when you are ready, when you have healed enough to think about what comes next, I would like you to consider staying. Not as a worker, not as someone who is just passing through, but as part of this family, as part of my life." Delilah's heart was hammering in her chest. "Carter, what are you saying?" He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I am saying that I have come to care for you, more than I probably should have, given how we met. I think about you all the time. I look forward to seeing you every morning. And I know this might be too soon, that you might not feel the same way, but I had to tell you. I had to let you know that if you wanted to stay, truly stay, I would be the happiest man in Kansas." Delilah felt tears prickling at her eyes, but for the first time in months they were not tears of grief. "I do not think it is too soon," she whispered. "I think maybe this is exactly the right time. Because I care for you too, Carter. I have been trying to tell myself it was not appropriate or not right, but I cannot help it. You make me feel safe. You make me feel alive again." The smile that broke across Carter's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "I will court you properly," he promised, "no matter what anyone says about timing or propriety. I will do this right." And he did. Over the rest of that summer and into autumn, Carter courted Delilah with a combination of old-fashioned formality and genuine warmth. He brought her flowers and small gifts, a pretty ribbon from the general store in Wichita, a book of poetry he thought she might like. He took her on rides across the ranch land, showing her his favorite places, the hidden valleys and clear streams and stands of ancient oak trees. He held her hand when Margaret was not looking, and stole kisses when they were sure they were alone. Margaret, for her part, seemed delighted by the development. She had clearly been hoping for exactly this outcome, and she made sure to give them space to be together while still maintaining a respectable level of propriety. After all, they were living under the same roof, and people would talk if things appeared inappropriate. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust, Carter asked Delilah to marry him. They were standing on the porch of the ranch house at sunset, watching the sky burn with color, and he turned to her and said simply, "Will you be my wife?" Delilah did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, and felt as though a door inside her had opened, letting in light she had thought she might never feel again. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in late October, in a small ceremony at the church in Wichita. The whole town turned out again, this time for a happier occasion, and there was a celebration afterward at the ranch with food and music and dancing. Margaret cried happy tears, and even the ranch hands got dressed up and offered their congratulations. That night, alone in the bedroom that was now theirs together, Carter held Delilah close and told her he loved her. She said it back, the words feeling both new and as though she had been saying them her whole life. When he kissed her, she tasted the promise of the future in it, a future she had thought was lost to her in the waters of the Arkansas River. Making love with him was both tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left them tangled together in the quilts, skin to skin, breathing in unison. Afterward, Carter traced lazy patterns on her shoulder and told her again how glad he was that she had come into his life. "Even though I nearly drowned first," Delilah teased. "Even then," Carter said seriously, "I would ride into 1,000 rivers if it meant finding you." The words should have been melodramatic, but somehow coming from him, they were simply true. Delilah curled closer against his side and let herself believe in happy endings. The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and joy. Delilah learned what it meant to be a rancher's wife, the responsibilities and challenges that came with it. She learned to doctor injured cattle, to help with birthing when necessary, to shoot a rifle well enough to scare off predators. She learned the business side too, taking over the books completely and even suggesting improvements to how they managed their sales and purchases. Carter, who had never been interested in the administrative side of ranching, was more than happy to let her handle it. Margaret gradually stepped back from running the household, passing the reins to Delilah with obvious satisfaction. The two women grew close, more like mother and daughter than in-laws, and Delilah found herself grateful for Margaret's wisdom and guidance. The older woman had a lifetime of experience living on the frontier, and she shared it generously. In the spring of their second year together, Delilah realized she was with child. She told Carter one evening after supper, when they were alone in their room, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her up in his arms, careful despite his excitement, and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly, setting her down gently. "Delilah, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Carter said, dropping to his knees and pressing his ear against her belly, which was still flat beneath her dress. "Hello in there," he said softly. "This is your father. I cannot wait to meet you." Delilah ran her fingers through his hair, feeling overwhelmed with love for this man who had pulled her from a river and given her a whole new life. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the summer heat made Delilah uncomfortable, and the morning sickness in the early months had been miserable. Margaret fussed over her, making sure she rested enough and ate properly, and Carter treated her like she was made of glass, to the point where Delilah had to remind him that she was pregnant, not dying. "I am fine," she insisted one day when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I am perfectly capable of doing my normal work." "I know," Carter said, looking sheepish. "I just worry. I could not bear it if anything happened to you or the baby." "Nothing is going to happen," Delilah assured him, going up on her toes to kiss his cheek. "I am healthy and strong. This baby is going to be fine." In December, on a cold night when snow was falling softly outside the windows, Delilah went into labor. Margaret took charge again, her calm competence a steadying force as the hours wore on. Carter paced the floor downstairs, occasionally coming up to check on Delilah, who alternated between walking the room to ease the contractions and lying on the bed, gripping Margaret's hand. It was long and difficult, as first births often were, but finally, in the gray light of dawn, their son was born. He came into the world squalling, healthy and pink, and when Margaret placed him in Delilah's arms, She felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. Carter came into the room, his face anxious, and froze when he saw them. "Is he all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Are you all right?" "We are perfect," Delilah said, smiling through her exhaustion. "Come meet your son." Carter approached the bed slowly, reverently, and when he looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the bundle of blankets, his expression transformed. "He is beautiful," he whispered. "He looks like you." "He has your nose," Delilah said. "Poor thing," Carter joked weakly, and then his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he said to Delilah. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for being here, for being my wife, for giving me a family." They named him Cole after Carter's father, and he became the center of their world. Margaret was a doting grandmother, and even the ranch hands could sometimes be found making silly faces at the baby when they thought no one was watching. Cole was a good baby, healthy and cheerful, with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that revolved around the needs of a small child and the ongoing demands of the ranch. Delilah navigated motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, learning as she went, accepting help from Margaret when she needed it. Carter was a devoted father, coming in from his work to hold his son, to sing him songs in an off-key baritone, to walk him around the house when he was fussy. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of Cole's growing up. First steps, first words, first time on a horse. The ranch prospered under their combined management, and they were able to hire more help, to expand their herd, to make improvements to the house and outbuildings. They were building something lasting, something that would endure. When Cole was 3, Delilah found herself pregnant again. This time the news was met with equal excitement but less surprise, and the pregnancy was easier than the first. Their daughter, whom they named Clara, was born on a warm spring evening, her arrival much quicker than her brother's had been. She was tiny and perfect, with dark eyes that would eventually lighten to hazel, and a temperament that was calm and observant even from the start. Cole was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her constantly, to show her his toys, to tell her stories even though she was too young to understand. Carter and Delilah watched their children together and marveled at the family they had created. Margaret lived to see both her grandchildren, to hold them and spoil them and pass on her stories and wisdom. She died peacefully in her sleep when Cole was 7 and Clara was 4, and though her passing was mourned, it was softened by the knowledge that she had been happy, that she had seen her son settled and content, that she had known the joy of grandchildren. They buried her next to Carter's father on the ranch, under a cottonwood tree she had always loved. After the funeral, Carter stood by the grave for a long time, and Delilah stood with him, her hand in his. "She was proud of you," Delilah said softly. "She told me many times how glad she was that you had found happiness." "She loved you like a daughter," Carter said. "From almost the moment you arrived. She told me once that she thought you were meant to be here, that you surviving that river was no accident." "Maybe she was right," Delilah said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Maybe we were meant to find each other." They stood there together until the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that reminded Delilah of that long-ago sunset when Carter had proposed. So much had changed since then, and yet some things remained constant. The love between them, the life they were building, the certainty that they belonged together. More years passed. Cole grew tall and strong, learning the ranch work from his father, developing the same quiet competence and dedication. Clara was clever and quick, with a gift for numbers that had her taking over the bookkeeping from Delilah before she was 15. The ranch continued to thrive, weathering droughts and hard winters, the occasional difficulty that was part and parcel of frontier life. Carter's hair began to show threads of silver at the temples, and Delilah found fine lines around her eyes that had not been there before. But they were happy lines, earned through years of laughter and love. Their bodies bore the marks of hard work and the passage of time, but when Carter looked at her, Delilah still saw the same warmth and desire that had been there from the beginning. Cole married when he was 23, bringing a wife named Sarah to the ranch. She was a good woman, the daughter of a farmer from outside Wichita, and she fit into the family easily. Clara showed no signs of wanting to marry, more interested in expanding the ranch's business ventures than in courting, though Delilah suspected that would change eventually. When Cole and Sarah had their first child, a daughter they named Margaret, Delilah held her granddaughter and felt the circle of life continuing. Carter stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and they both smiled at this newest addition to the family. "You ever think about that day?" Carter asked her that night when they were alone in their room. "The day I pulled you from the river, all the time," Delilah admitted. "I think about how close I came to dying, how different everything would have been if you had not been there. I think about how terrified I was and how that terror turned into this." She gestured around them at the life they had built. "Sometimes it does not seem real." "It is real," Carter said, pulling her close. "Every bit of it, and I thank God for it every day. For you, for our children, for the life we have made together." "I love you," Delilah said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she said them. "I have loved you since that summer when you asked me to stay, maybe even before that, though I did not know it then. I loved you from the moment I saw you clinging to that driftwood," Carter said. "I looked at you and something in me knew that you were important, that I had to save you, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because you were meant to be mine." They made love that night with the tenderness and passion that had never faded between them, even after all the years. And afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Delilah thought about how strange and wonderful life could be, how tragedy and joy could be so closely intertwined, how you could lose everything and find something even better in the ruins. She thought about the girl she had been, clinging to driftwood in a raging river, certain she was going to die. That girl could never have imagined this future, this happiness. Could never have dreamed that the man on horseback would become her husband, her partner, the father of her children and grandfather to her grandchildren. But life had a way of surprising you, of taking you down paths you never expected. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those unexpected paths led you exactly where you needed to be. The seasons continued their endless cycle, spring giving way to summer, autumn to winter, and back again. The ranch changed and grew, adapting to new times and new challenges. Cole took over more of the day-to-day operations, allowing Carter to slow down a bit, though he never stopped working entirely. Delilah remained deeply involved in managing the business side, her sharp mind for numbers and strategy ensuring the ranch's continued prosperity. Clara eventually did marry, surprising everyone by choosing a lawyer from Wichita named James Morrison. He was a good man, if a bit formal, and he clearly adored her. They divided their time between a house in town and the ranch, and Clara continued to help with the business even after she became a mother herself. Carter and Delilah grew old together, their hair going gray, their movements slowing. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, seasoned by shared experiences and tempered by the challenges they had faced together. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, holding hands like young lovers. One evening, when Carter was 70 and Delilah 68, they sat in their usual spots, watching the sky. It was summer, and the air was warm and sweet with the smell of grass and wildflowers. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "Did you ever imagine this?" Delilah asked. "When we first met, did you imagine we would end up here like this?" "I hoped for it," Carter said, "but imagination could never do justice to the reality. Being with you has been better than anything I could have dreamed." "Even though I was nothing but trouble from the start," Delilah teased. "Nearly drowning, needing to be rescued, imposing on your hospitality." "Especially because of that," Carter said, his eyes crinkling with humor. "What kind of story would we have if we had met at a church social or a barn dance? This way is much more interesting." Delilah laughed, the sound still bright despite her years. "I suppose you are right, though I could have done without the terror and the nearly dying part." "I am glad I was there," Carter said, his voice turning serious. "I am glad I could save you, because saving you saved me too. I did not know how lonely I was until you came into my life. You and Mother, we were fine, but there was something missing. You filled that emptiness." "You did the same for me," Delilah said softly. "I lost everything in that river, my uncle, my past, my sense of who I was. But you gave me a new life, a better life. You gave me love and family and a home. You gave me everything that matters." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, the shadows lengthening across the land they had worked for so many years. The grandchildren came running up to the porch, demanding cookies and attention, and Carter and Delilah obliged them, dispensing treats and hugs with equal generosity. That night, lying in bed with Carter's arm around her, Delilah thought about the journey that had brought her here. From that terrifying day in the river to this moment of perfect contentment. It had not always been easy. There had been losses and disappointments, hard times and struggles. But there had also been so much joy, so much love. She thought about the twist of fate that had put Carter on that riverbank at exactly the right moment, about how close she had come to death and how fully she had embraced life afterward. About how the worst day of her life had led directly to the best days. "What are you thinking about?" Carter murmured sleepily. "About how grateful I am," Delilah said. "For you, for this life, for everything." "Me too," Carter said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Every single day, I am grateful." They drifted off to sleep together, as they had done thousands of times before, secure in their love and in the knowledge that they had built something lasting. The ranch would continue after them, passed down to their children and grandchildren. But more than that, the love they had shared, the family they had created, would endure. It would ripple out through generations, a legacy more valuable than any amount of land or cattle. Outside, the prairie stretched away into darkness, vast and timeless. The Arkansas River flowed on as it always had, sometimes gentle and sometimes dangerous. But in the house on the Lazy L Ranch, there was only peace and love and the quiet breathing of two people who had found each other against all odds. The years continued to pass gently. Carter and Delilah remained active and involved in the ranch and in their growing family, though they gradually handed over more responsibilities to Cole and Clara. They became the beloved patriarch and matriarch, the ones everyone came to for advice and wisdom, for stories about the old days, for the comfort of their steady presence. They celebrated 50 years of marriage with a party that brought people from all over the county. The ranch house was full of family and friends, of food and music and laughter. Cole stood up to make a toast, his voice thick with emotion as he talked about his parents' love and dedication, about the example they had set, about how lucky he and Clara were to have been raised by them. Carter and Delilah stood together, his arm around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder, and accepted the love and good wishes of everyone around them. When someone asked Carter what the secret to a long and happy marriage was, he smiled and said simply, "Marry the right person, and then choose them every day for the rest of your life." It was good advice, born of experience, and everyone nodded in agreement. As they moved into their 70s, their bodies began to slow more noticeably. Carter's knees ached on cold mornings, and Delilah's hands sometimes trembled when she tried to do fine work. But they adapted, finding new ways to contribute, new rhythms that accommodated their aging bodies. They spent more time sitting together, talking, remembering. They took slow walks around the ranch, pointing out changes and improvements, remembering how things used to be. One afternoon in early autumn, when the air was crisp and the leaves on the cottonwoods were turning gold, they rode out together to the spot where Carter had proposed all those years ago. They rode slowly on gentle horses, and when they reached the creek, they dismounted carefully and sat on the bank just as they had done that long-ago day. "You remember what you said to me?" Delilah asked, watching the water flow past. "Every word," Carter said. "I told you I wanted you to stay, that I wanted you to be part of my life. You said you would be the happiest man in Kansas if I agreed," Delilah reminded him with a smile. "I was wrong about that," Carter said, and when Delilah looked at him in surprise, he continued, "I became the happiest man in the world when you said yes." Delilah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "You have always known exactly what to say to me." "That is because I have always meant every word," Carter said, taking her hand. "Delilah, being your husband has been the greatest privilege of my life. Every day with you has been a gift. Even the hard days," Delilah asked. "Especially the hard days," Carter said. "Because we faced them together. That is what marriage is. Not just sharing the good times, but standing together through the difficulties. And we have done that. We have built a life together that I could not be more proud of." They sat there for a long time, two old people holding hands by a creek, remembering and appreciating. Eventually, they mounted their horses again and rode slowly back to the ranch, where their family was waiting. More seasons passed. Grandchildren grew up and started families of their own. The ranch continued to thrive under Cole's management, and Clara's financial acumen ensured its stability for future generations. Carter and Delilah became great-grandparents, holding tiny babies with trembling but experienced hands, marveling at the continuation of the family line. On a warm spring day when Carter was 76, he suffered a stroke while working in the barn. It was not a massive one, and he survived, but it left him weakened. His left side did not work quite right anymore, and his speech was sometimes slurred. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Delilah never wavered. She cared for him with the same devotion he had shown her all their years together. She helped him with tasks that had become difficult, encouraged him when he grew frustrated with his limitations, sat with him for hours reading aloud or just talking. The roles had reversed from their early days when he had been her rescuer and protector. Now she was his strength, his support. "I am sorry," Carter said one day, when he was having particular difficulty with his weakened hand. "I am sorry you have to take care of me like this." "Do not be ridiculous," Delilah said firmly. "You saved my life, Carter Lawson. You pulled me from that river and gave me everything I have. Taking care of you now is not a burden, it is an honor." Carter's eyes filled with tears. "I love you," he said, the words slightly slurred but no less sincere. "I love you too," Delilah said, kissing him softly. "I will always love you." They had 3 more years together after Carter's stroke. 3 years of quiet companionship, of family gatherings and peaceful days. Carter's health slowly declined, but his spirit remained strong. He watched his family grow and thrive, and he held Delilah's hand every night as they fell asleep. On a cold January night, just after they had celebrated Delilah's 73rd birthday, Carter died peacefully in his sleep. Delilah woke in the morning to find him still and quiet beside her, and though she had known this day would come, the pain of it nearly broke her. But she had her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren around her. She had the ranch that she and Carter had built together. She had the memories of a lifetime of love. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that what she and Carter had shared was something rare and precious. They buried him next to his parents, under the cottonwood trees. It seemed like half of Kansas came to the funeral, a testament to the man he had been, the respect he had earned, the love he had inspired. Delilah stood dry-eyed through the service, drawing on a strength she had not known she still possessed. Afterward, when everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, she sat alone in the room she had shared with Carter for so many years. She picked up the quilt from their bed, the one Margaret had made for their wedding, and held it close. It smelled like Carter, like home, like love. She allowed herself to cry then, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the man she had lost, for the empty space beside her in the bed, for the conversation partner she would never have again. She cried for all the years they had had, and for all the years they would not have now. But eventually the tears subsided, and Delilah wiped her eyes and sat up straighter. Carter would not want her to spend the rest of her life mourning. He would want her to live, to continue engaging with their family, to find joy where she could. And so she did. She remained active in the ranch's business, offering advice when asked, but letting Cole make the final decisions. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories about Carter, about the early days of the ranch, about the history they carried within them. She worked in her garden, kept up with her reading, maintained her friendships in town. But every evening she would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, and she would think about Carter, about the day he had ridden into the river to save her, about the life they had built together, about how a moment of terrible danger had led to decades of love and happiness. She lived for another 7 years after Carter died, 7 years of quiet contentment and gentle aging. Her children worried that she was lonely, but she assured them she was fine. She had her memories, she had her family, and she had the knowledge that she had been truly, deeply loved. On a spring evening when the prairie was covered in wildflowers and the air was sweet and warm, Delilah Jenkins Lawson died peacefully in her sleep, just as her husband had. She was 80 years old, and she had lived a full and remarkable life. They buried her next to Carter, under the cottonwoods, and the whole family gathered to say goodbye. Cole spoke at the service, his voice breaking as he talked about his mother's strength, her kindness, her unwavering love for her family. Clara read a poem that had been one of Delilah's favorites. The great-grandchildren placed wildflowers on the grave. And when everyone else had gone, when the sun was setting and the sky was painted in gold and crimson, a lone figure stood by the graves. It was the oldest of the great-grandchildren, a young woman named Margaret after her great-great-grandmother, but called Maggie by everyone. She stood there looking at the 2 simple headstones, side by side. Carter Lawson, beloved husband and father. Delilah Jenkins Lawson, beloved wife and mother. The dates of their births and deaths, and underneath, a simple inscription, together in life, together in eternity. Maggie had heard the story of how they met many times, about the river and the rescue and the love that had grown from it. It had always seemed romantic and distant, like something from a storybook. But standing here, looking at these graves, she felt the reality of it. These were real people who had loved each other deeply, who had built a life together, who had created the family that she was part of. She thought about how close it had come to never happening. If Carter had not been riding fence line that day, if he had not seen Delilah, if he had not had the courage to ride into the river, her grandmother Clara would not have been born. Her mother would not have been born. She would not exist. The entire family, everything they were and had, traced back to that single moment of bravery and the love that had grown from it. It was humbling and profound and beautiful. "Thank you," Maggie whispered to the graves. "Thank you for finding each other. Thank you for the family you gave us. Thank you for showing us what love should be." The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves, a sound like whispered voices or gentle laughter. The sun sank lower, painting everything in shades of gold. And in that moment, standing in the place where her great-great-grandparents rested together, Maggie felt a sense of connection and continuity that went beyond words. The story that had begun with a woman clinging to driftwood in a river and a cowboy brave enough to save her had not ended with their deaths. It continued on, in the lives they had touched, in the family they had created, in the love that had been their greatest legacy. And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever came after this life, Carter and Delilah were together again. Together as they always should be, as they always would be, forever bound by the love that had begun on a riverbank in Kansas all those years ago. The love that had survived hardship and loss, that had grown stronger with time, that had created something lasting and beautiful. A love story for the ages, written in the vast expanse of the American West, where the prairie met the sky and anything was possible.